Good morning and welcome to the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. I'm a first-year student. My name is Charlie Hamlin at Sloan, and I'm very excited to introduce this panel, NBA 2.0, New Rules to Transform the Game. We have a great panel assembled. Rafael Stone, General Counsel of the Houston Rockets, Evan Wash, SVP of Basketball Analytics and Strategy for the NBA, Mike Zarin, Assistant GM of the Boston Celtics and Team Counsel, and Ben Falk, former VP of Basketball Strategy for the 76ers. The panel is moderated today by Kevin Arnovitz of ESPN. The conversation should last around 45 minutes, with 5 reserved at the end for question and answer from the audience. So if you have a question during the discussion, please submit it through Twitter using the hashtag #NewNBA. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Visual aid?
Yeah, it has.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for joining us. The intros have been done, so I don't have to do that. I'll start by just kind of challenging the whole premise of the panel, and we can just go outside and have coffee for 45 minutes, which is the NBA is at the apex of its popularity, its reach, things are going great, and yet everything's amazing and nobody's happy. Like, why do we have to change a thing? Why brew up some new Coke when the formula's working?
You don't have to.
As the official representative from the
Things
NBA.
are pretty good, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll jump in. I think in a lot of industries, when things are going well, that's the perfect time to innovate, right? We've got a really passionate fan base who's constantly giving us ideas for how we could improve our product, and I think we'd be foolish to turn a deaf ear to that. If there's ways we can improve our game, our content, either to make it safer for players, boost the integrity, make more engaging content for our fans, we should always be looking to do that, whether we're going through great times or bad times.
It's also the case that for a long period of time, the league didn't have a culture of innovation. And so it's sort of exciting to see the league office taking new ideas very seriously right now. Not all of them are going to happen, but they want to hear. And that's been a big change. So there may be some pent-up demand also.
And I'd say if you look at how we got here, how we got here was through innovation. I mean, I think that the league right now is so popular partly because of things like different enforcement of the hand check rules, changing the illegal defense rules. I mean, even if you go all the way back, like implementation of the three-point line. Why did they even do that? But that's a huge part of why the league is so popular these days.
I mean, that was a patently wacky idea.
Right.
I mean, and yet it is now the basis of pretty much every offensive attack. It seems to me that you kind of can subdivide reform proposals in 3 ways. Either they're to address a game that should be more marketable or watchable, make it just more fun, if you will, make it more safe, or make it more fair, to make the spirit of the law conform to the actual law. It seems like when kind of our pre-conversations for the head of this panel, the ones about watchability, marketability, making the game more fun, more interesting. And I want to start with playoff reform just because it's been in the news this week. And Mike Zarin actually brought visual aids.
Oh, we'll get to that.
For a conversation.
Just
but,
one.
I mean, where are we? I mean, is this a paramount issue we need to take up right now?
Do you guys think it's a big problem, playoff reform? We need to change the playoffs?
No.
Okay, good. Do you guys think it's a big problem? Yes. So if we're just looking at 1 to 16 versus 8 and 8, right? That's the sort of the topic of the moment, right? My take on it is you're doing that for 2 reasons. One is every so often there's some team in one conference that would have made the playoffs in the other conference, and they feel aggrieved somehow that they don't get the chance to lose to the number 1 seed, like the team that would have anyway. And then the other reason to do it might be because you want the 2 best teams to end up in the finals, and they might both be in the same conference. But the problem with that idea, well, the biggest problem everyone's talked about is the travel. So we looked at this some, and the league has looked at it more. I think it was 30,000 miles of additional travel on average, in some years more.
Right. This is the Miami versus Portland round 1.
Yeah, and the crazy
starting.
thing is it's not just that's the average. So that's more than the circumference of the Earth added to the NBA's travel during the playoffs. But the bigger issue is the variance between series. You could have years where there's like 50,000 miles of travel added to the playoffs. That's 2 circumferences of the Earth, in case you couldn't do that math. In which case, why are you here? But the 2 other things that happen that I think people don't talk about besides the travel are rivalries get diminished. So we looked at 20 years of playoffs, and if you did 1 through 16, your most frequent opponent, you'd face them 3 times, and now it's like 6. So you don't have the Pistons have to get past the Celtics, Bulls have to get past the Pistons, you know, Heat and Knicks thing that happened. People like those rivalries. I grew up on one of those rivalries. LeBron talks about those rivalries as being really important to him, getting past the Celtics. So that goes away in large part. And then the other thing that happens that I think people have ignored is there's fewer teams in contention if you only have one line.
Right. Do we have the visual aid for this? Is that...
I had, is David Sparks here? He works for us, and he looked at the last 20 years of playoffs and looked at so you could put up that in contention slide there. If you look at it, there's just over one team fewer in contention over the last 2 months of the season. So that's a city's worth of playoff interest.
Oh, here we go.
Right, so the x-axis is the number of days before the end of the season, and the y-axis is the number of teams within 2 games of the playoffs. And so this is David's slide. Good work, David. Obviously, we love him. You know, you're just taking a city that would have interest in the playoffs and saying, oh, you're not that close to the playoffs anymore, so because there's only one line. I think getting rid of that's bad in order to make it slightly more fair for one team in a conference that doesn't really feel that aggrieved, except every few years you have a Phoenix, and they get upset. What was it, 2015, 14? I don't know. I just think that this is worse for the league than the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, you mentioned a really interesting solution.
Look, so a couple things, right? So what Kevin said about the goals of these changes, I think those are the right goals, but the order of them also matters, because we're never going to make a change to make the game more fun if it negatively impacts fairness or health of our players, right? So you look at this playoff change, yeah, arguably it's more fair to take the 16 best teams, putting aside the regular season playoff contention piece that Mike just raised. But if it would unduly impact player health through that added travel and unduly impact the fairness of the playoffs through that travel, I mean, people talk about that series. So the Miami-Portland example, that's a burden for the players in that series. It's also unfair for the winner of that series in the next round when they're playing a team that, frankly, may not have left home. If it happened to be a Lakers-Clippers or Knicks-Nets series or Bulls-Bucks, they wouldn't have left home, and so now you've got some competitive unfairness there. So these things all play together. There's all these levers that work together. And so when we look at this, we're trying to address all 3 of those things, not just one. Adam said at his press conference at All-Star Weekend that it's not just about that one team that misses the playoffs every year with a top 16 record, although we care about that team. It's also about ensuring that our best teams play as late as possible in the playoffs, right? And he said that out a couple times. And I think, one alternative that's been tossed around, if you were focused only on that, is you could reseed, for example, at the conference finals, right? So you play the first 2 rounds within conference, you get to your final 4, and then you reseed, so you could have teams play across conferences. And what that would do is ensure that your best 2 teams would never meet in essentially that conference finals round. And so if the best 2 teams advance, they can always play in the final. So there's ways around some of these things. It's just, again, there's a lot of hurdles to get over.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you could also allow teams to choose, allow the top seed to choose. That they'll have their best health in mind. So that takes care of that argument. And it seems to me that's more fair.
G League did that.
I know. I think that's a really cool idea. By the way, yeah.
So just if the Warriors or Rockets, whoever finished with the top record for Toronto for that matter, we get to our Final Four, the
No,
best
not Final Four.
Are you saying the entire playoffs?
The entire playoffs,
With each round?
Yeah.
I'm imagining a bunch of travel bookers going, oh, God.
They have that problem anyway.
No, that problem happens anyway because you don't know who you're going to play.
You don't know who you're going to play. So, yeah, this solves for, I think, all of Mike's concerns while still allowing for the premise of allowing the best teams to end up playing the latest.
I want to move on to some in-game reforms. You had a really interesting one that I liked in an email. You said basically the ball has to clear the timeline now in 6 seconds, not 8 seconds.
Yeah, so this one is obviously just stylistic and it's completely subjective, but I like pressing. So one thing that doesn't exist in the NBA, because the players are just too good, and maybe the season's too long, to allow for it to be a great strategy, is pressing like a full court press during the game. But if you shorten the time to clear half court to 6 seconds, you'd have to do a couple things. No live ball timeouts, shorten it to 6 seconds, and fouls in the backcourt are no longer team fouls. All of that would hugely encourage pressing. And so to me, that would be really, really interesting. And I think there's when we get to health, right, pressing is extremely frantic, it's high intensity and everything else. So maybe one of the things that you do is you only do it at the end of quarter, something like that, a little bit like how we do with intentional fouls, or not intentional fouls, but off-the-ball fouls.
Well, we'll call it the T.J. McConnell.
Exactly. And so anyway, I do think, so I just like pressing. So I think anything that brings it back into the NBA would be really cool. And I think if you did that, then coaches and players would adjust and would start using it.
You know that James isn't going to like that.
James would be fine. James will adjust to every rule, and he'll still lead the league in scoring and assists. It'll be okay.
In terms of flow, and flow to me is a big one, and just in terms of just the watchability of a game. You and I kind of share a common loathing of the free throw as a feature of basketball, and you have. You want to present that idea?
No, it's not a loathing of the free throw as much.
I loathe it.
That's fine. I mean, the free throw is an important part of basketball. I think as we've studied the flow of the game the last few years and made significant changes to timeout structures, halftime, free throw procedures, or where the shooter can go between free throws, we look at a lot of fan data as to how fans are engaging with the content throughout the game. We've done things like dial testing where they can say, like, I like this aspect, I don't like this. And what you find is that there's sort of the big three of things that really turn off fans from our game, and that's timeouts or commercials, instant replays, and free throws. And so we still have to serve our media partners, and so we have, of course, commercial inventory. And we've done our best with instant replay, and actually we only average about 2 minutes of instant replay dead time per game because a lot of the replays happen during breaks.
Why does it seem like an hour?
It's not a normal distribution, right? So there's extreme cases where it's more, but the average is 2 minutes. So we look at free throws and say there's actually 20 minutes a game, roughly, a little less, where players are shooting free throws. And if that's all content time that our fans don't enjoy, what can you do with that? Well, you have two options. One, make it content time they do enjoy by trying to layer in, enhancements or other commercial inventory that you could otherwise have had during timeouts. Or you can try to significantly cut down that free throw time. And there's not a lot of ways to do that without cutting down the free throws themselves. So one idea that sort of our think tank group at the league kicks around is, what if you just shot one free throw in all free throw instances, right? So on a 2-point shooting foul or a foul on the penalty, one shot worth 2 points. If it's a 3, one shot worth 3. And you'd save about 7 minutes of free throw time right off the bat. And I think this is something that our basketball folks don't necessarily love, because it goes to the core of the game, but it's one of the things that we just think about for some futuristic world where maybe you want to optimize the parts of the game that fans enjoy watching. So we bounce around these crazy ideas.
In the final 2 minutes, though.
Yeah, I think when we've talked about it, we said, like, just to make sure we're not creating an incentive for a trailing team to really foul down the stretch when the higher variance of 0 or 2 points would create an incentive to foul, you could go back to regular free throw shooting at the 2-minute mark or something. But there's lots of ways to do it, obviously.
But like the key to this is the data that they have that says fans stop watching during free throws. And I think that, this isn't just to speed up the game because we have some arbitrary time that we want the game to go faster, but actually people who are consuming our product don't like that part of the game, even if a lot of very purist people, prefer to have it a certain way. So, I mean, again, kudos to the league for considering things that make people happier in the game, right?
Right. I mean, I always said it's sort of people tune in for the exceptional. You get like what Russell Westbrook does, only a few people on the planet can do. Pretty much anybody can stand 15 feet from a basket and try.
But it'd be pretty exciting if that were worth 3 points or 0.
See, that's the thing.
Yeah, and variance at the end of the games. I mean, I get the pushback, but it creates more excitement, right?
Oh no, we have no problem with the variance. If the variance creates an incentive to foul, then it's a problem because now you're stopping the game more, and we want to have a more free-flowing game.
It would.
You think it would?
Yeah, it would.
Okay.
I mean, to me, to your point of like why the NBA is so successful now, I think one of the aspects is flow. So people talk about like there aren't many parts of the game where, for this generation, for all of us who now have, a million things pulling at our attention, there aren't many parts where you would sit there and be like, oh, I don't want to pay attention to the game anymore. Football and baseball have a lot more stoppages and are a lot slower, and I think that's part of the success of basketball. And so looking at finding these ways to increase the flow, to reduce the stoppages and keep what's successful about the game, make it more prevalent, I mean, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I mean, what Mike said, like, this gets lost a lot. We don't think we have a game length issue. Our average games are down to about 2 hours and 10 minutes this season, and we're really comfortable at that number. It's more about how fans are engaging during that, right? So changing aspects of flow may have a length impact, and that's okay, but it's about optimizing the time that the fans are engaging with your content, and if there's ways to improve it, which either affect or don't affect length, we're open to them.
This is truly the second generation. It almost sounds like a conversation we'll have in the media, which is it's not so much how many hits your piece gets anymore, it's how much time people spend on it and how much they engage with the content itself.
Yeah.
Any other flow proposals?
I mean, I think somewhat similarly, so I have a whole thing about fouls, right?
Yeah, which
I think ties in here. But I mean, one of the things to me is, and Kevin Pelton has talked about this, is that a foul should never be a reward for the defense, right? So or for whoever's committing the foul, right? It should be a penalty. And so I think when there's an incentive to foul, it also touches on this exact aspect, which is it kind of messes with the flow of the game. And so whether there's things we can think about to not reward fouling in specific situations, and so the ones that you typically see it are obviously the intentional foul of a bad shooter, and you also see end of game intentional fouling, and then kind of the foul that they were trying to eliminate with the clear path, which hasn't been fully effective, but stopping a fast break. And so all of those are ways that kind of mess with this flow of the game, and there's other considerations involved, but it would be interesting to see if there's ways to tweak the rules such that you reduce the number of times where the defense has an incentive to foul.
I spoke to an NBA coach this week, kind of soliciting ideas for this, because I want to hear what NBA coaches feel about this stuff. And he kind of threw a question back at me. He's like, let me ask you a question. If in one decade the average NBA team is attempting 51 three-pointers, which he feels like is a probability, at any point do we have to look at the game itself and recalibrate it with that in mind?
Of course. I mean, so we're averaging 27, 28 this year league-wide. The Rockets are at 43, 44. Historically, the Rockets have been a predictor of where the league's going to go. So if you believe that 3 years ago the Rockets were at 27 and everyone else was at 18 and now everyone's caught up, if our 85 shots a game end up being 90% three-pointers, we've got a problem, right? So there's clearly somewhere where it crosses over the line to we need to address it.
Has the think tank identified where that is?
No, I don't think there's a magic number, right? I mean, I think it depends. Like, I think we're really comfortable where we are, and I think we know if we had 75 threes a game, we'd have a problem. So it's somewhere between here and there. And I think it's kind of like we'll know it when we see it, and we'll have to deal, but the what you do is the much more interesting question. So we have an annual NBA hackathon, and one of the questions we asked students last summer was to try to predict the evolution of shot distribution, and then if you believe it's a problem, what you're predicting, come up with ways that you could address it. And we got some crazy stuff. I mean, things like after a team makes X two-pointers, so mid-range shots in a game, all subsequent mid-range shots become worth 3 points. Okay, so that there's an incentive to shoot twos early to get to that threshold. Not something I think we would do, but like those types of ideas, we also, a fairly simple change, but radical, of course, would be change the point values. Instead of 2-3, make it 3-4, so that it's not a 50% more valuable shot, it's a 33% more valuable shot. So like, there's all these crazy ideas out there as to what you could do in that future world where you have just too much outside shooting.
Is it a problem? Could it be a problem?
Well, so I was going to ask that because I hear this a lot of like, oh, the game seems to be, it's all threes and layups, like. And I don't really know why that's a problem, because I feel like it's very interesting. It's a very interesting tension. So if you didn't have the three-point line, everyone packs the paint, and all you're doing is trying to protect the rim and force outside shots. And now you have to both defend the basket and the farthest points from the basket. And so that means that strategically, you have to figure out how to do something that's very difficult. And you have to make all these interesting trade-offs. And so if everyone is spacing further, that makes more offense, that opens up more space, that makes it harder for the defense. And it's still, even though threes are valuable, the most valuable place to shoot is the rim. It's the highest percentage shot. If you can get an open shot there, you draw fouls there. So everyone's still trying to get to the rim. Threes are secondary to that. And by shooting more threes, you open up more space to get to the rim. Defensively, you then have to scheme and figure out how do you take away both. And so, I don't see it as a problem necessarily that teams are sliding further back and taking more threes because it just increases that tension.
Yeah, for me, I feel like this is kind of an empirical question when people don't, like, we're at the apex of NBA viewership historically right now, so people seem to like the product. If they start to not like it as much, then we should tweak it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, to me, the aesthetic, one of the reasons I actually think threes have directly led to people liking it more. The space creates the ability for, presumably there's always 1% of people who really understood the game, who could see the subtleties of it and everything else. But with greater space, there's greater visibility on what these great players are doing. And, when I was growing up, crossovers weren't as big a thing, but now this guy is isolated on an island because of all the space, and when you really get him, it oohs and ahs, and it's really kind of a cool thing that without that space you couldn't see. So even if you're making a great move, it's more subtle and you can't see it as well. I don't necessarily think we've gone far. I mean, I won't be shocking, but I think a 4-point line is more interesting to me than somehow clogging it back up. Plus, the other thing about basketball is height is obviously this enormous thing, but again, the space equalizes height, so it allows more people to be more effective. And fundamentally, I think the better the athlete, regardless of height, the better it is for the game. So having something where somebody who's 5'10" and a once in a generation athlete can be successful, I think is really important for the game.
I want to talk about a couple of structural issues. Draft reform. I mean, you are you created the concept of the wheel. It has been in conversation. Where is the league on this? Do they see, is this a solution in search of a problem? I have many issues with the draft, but just kind of want to hear where we are.
Well, the league just made draft reform.
I'm sorry?
We just made draft reform.
There was, Calvin, the underlying incentive structure is still there, right?
Sure.
You run a terrible franchise, you get rewarded with the best talent which has no choice in where it's going. I mean, it's still an underlying.
So that's a fundamental question about the purpose of the draft, right? Is the purpose of the draft to redistribute, to distribute talent to teams that need access to that talent, or is the purpose of the draft to just find homes for 18, 19, 20-year-old players? I think our view very strongly is that it's a competitive balance issue, and we want to make sure teams have the opportunity to get access to these players. We want to make sure that it's not the teams that are already successful getting those players. And so you're balancing that with the winning incentives. And so the change we made this last year, which will go in effect next season, is essentially to flatten out the odds at the top of the lottery. It's a incremental change, but the idea behind it was to marginally reduce the incentive for a team to race to the bottom. That now there's not a significant difference in terms of your draft expectation when you finish with the worst record or the 5th or 6th worst record. And so we won't see teams hopefully trying to outmaneuver each other for those positions at the end of the season. But it's the underlying issues are there. Either you're a team competing for a championship or you're a rebuilding team and you want access to those players.
Right. The problem with any lottery system, right, is there's still some, there's trade-offs. You have the teams, with incentives to be really terrible problem. You also have the just random distribution of players problem that you made that goes against the thing you're talking about. So the more you shift the odds away from the worst teams in a lottery system, obviously you're helping some other teams. You have the randomness problem, right? Cleveland or Orlando could win it a couple years in a row. I mean, there's a bunch of these problems that you're trying to solve with the draft system. What incentives are there at the end of the season? Problems. What incentives are there in game? You might call that like the Mark Madsen problem, right? So there's like a bunch of different problems that you're trying to solve with draft systems. So, as long as we've decided that this year's worst teams should have a better chance to get the best young players for next year, I sort of supported the reform that happened, only because.
I mean, you support it because it was better than what it's existing?
It's better than what was existing. Yeah, I mean, people. I think, and I don't know what the data shows, people are more likely to want to go see a 25-win team than a 15-win team, right? So you're sort of getting rid of incentives for teams to get really, really bad. So that's good. I think people sort of know where I stand on the whole topic. We have to rehash it at this year's conference, but it seems to me that...
Rehash it a little bit.
It seems to me that taking turns in the draft, as long as the frequency with which you get a collection of good picks would still help teams with some reasonable enough frequency that would help. But I mean, I think the reason that idea didn't get too much traction, and it may be right, is the goose is pretty golden right now in the NBA. Life is, for our league is really good, and making drastic changes may just not make that much sense.
Do teams have a dog in the fight on one and done? I mean, or is it a case of, hey, look, you just tell us who's eligible, we'll find the best talent, but do teams care?
We care. I mean, but not a ton, right? So like that, I think that anytime you change the rules, it's going to have some rolling ramifications. So I think that we have an opinion on it, but I don't. Yeah, he just hit me with my zapper. So that's
I mean, it gets to be an issue when you start talking about collectively bargainable issues.
Right.
Then you sort of wait for the commissioner.
Ben can weigh in.
Ben can weigh in. He's
So, I mean, I think, as Rafael was saying, I think teams are obviously interested in how it affects, their scouting operations, their budget, how it affects bringing in players who might not be as ready, and development and all those issues. The question is whether through, smart rulemaking, you could solve some of those in a way that is, more fair to players in general, and might even help the league. But I think there are certainly real concerns with that. The era of scouting in high school gyms, I've talked to people who were in the league scouting at that time, and that was not fun for a lot of these guys, planning trips with schedules that might change at the last minute, going way off track to some random high school, and then just the problem of evaluating. I mean, the teams are all trying to do their best evaluating talent, and it's a lot more difficult when you're evaluating younger players playing against worse competition, with questionable coaching. So, I mean, I think that teams obviously have real concerns. The question, I think, for the league is, can you structure rules in ways that mitigate a lot of those concerns?
One proposal I hear constantly from executives is they'd like to see the draft come after free agency. The idea being that for planning purposes, the draft is a place you go for need. Let's see what you can do in free agency. And wouldn't it be great if the draft we're addressing some of the deficiencies coming out of free agency?
I didn't love this when I first heard it, and Austin Ainge, who is here somewhere, has convinced me completely that this is a good idea. A lot of times it's draft night, and you're talking to teams about trades you might do, particularly involving contracts with 1 year left, and you got to leave your cap space open because you have some percentage chance of getting a max free agent, which the stars drive the league. So whatever the small chance is, it's probably better than whatever the deal is that you're going to do to make a drastic change to your franchise. And then, of course, for every max free agent, there's 5 suitors and only 1 winner. So the other 4 teams had chances to do things that would have improved their team for the next season on draft night, which is the busiest trading night of the year, and didn't take those chances because of the small percentage chance that they would get the free agent after July 1st. And it just seems to me like that's a ridiculous market inefficiency. The scheduling becomes a little bit of an issue with Summer League. You want your draft picks to play in Summer League. When do you start free agency? There is sort of a collective bargaining issue here too, but I don't think I'll get in too much trouble for saying move the date of the start of the moratorium in free agency. But I don't really see a good argument against, other than when does the scheduling happen in Olympics years? There's an audit that has to happen to set the cap numbers. That needs to include money received in the finals, so there has to be some time to do the auditing to set the cap. We have the draft right now while that audit's going on. And so then free agency starts and it works fine. So the question is, could you move that audit up a little bit, or roll over some numbers? And I don't know. That's a question for you guys.
I'm neutral.
But I think this would make a big difference in teams' efficient allocation of their cap.
We've mapped it out a little bit. I mean, the calendar issues do come into play. I think a lot of team people would lose their August vacations, so I'm not sure how you'd feel about that. But
didn't get one this year anyway.
Yeah, but definitely not losing vacations.
Cleveland kept us a little busy during August this year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces, right? There's a CBA piece. There's a summer league timing. There's issues around international competitions, right? We want to encourage our young players to play for their national teams or not, which is another hot button issue. So they all work together. Again, it's just trying to make a good decision that factors all these in. But I hear the rationale on team building. I mean, there's just to be clear, it's not a unanimous view, right? There are certainly teams that have expressed as they prefer draft first, but there may be a majority the other way.
We need to spend some time on the scheduling question and come up with a proposed schedule for this, and then maybe people would see it and like it better. We haven't yet.
Funny you say, because this is the first, the question on the, I'm taking audience questions now. And
Is it from Austin?
This,
Just kidding.
it is unidentified, but it is how real is the conversation to decrease the number of games in the season? Evan, is this on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of seriousness? I feel like my sense is it has gone up. It's a legitimate conversation where it was a deal breaker before.
I guess I'd ask the question back, for what reason, right? Like I don't think anyone is in favor of shortening the season just for the sake of shortening the season, right? So people talk about different benefits you get from that. Reducing back-to-backs, trying to increase the meaningfulness of any individual game, creating time for things like play-in tournaments or balanced schedules, which would need more travel, like all those types of things. So it depends what your goal is. Just to say, hey, we're going to cut 10 games to cut 10 games, that just cuts revenue.
Well, I mean, I think
But the one that you didn't mention is if you talk to people from other sports, the scientists will say your schedule is insane. Of course, you have a lot of injuries.
Sure, and we're doing a ton of scientific work and study to understand the impact of the schedule, and there isn't definitive data out there that says that the compression of the schedule creates injuries, right? I mean, sometimes it even cuts the other way. So I think we're just trying to get our hands around what are the goals.
I mean, I think there are really smart people in sports science who would disagree fundamentally with that.
We have not seen any papers that show, or any studies that show a correlation or a causation between a back-to-back and an injury, but I mean, it's
not so much back-to-back, just the overall number of games. I mean, I think the back-to-back.
Sure, but player load, I mean, and again, I'm not an expert in this area, but player load is a function of not just games. It's practice, it's training. I mean, it's all these other things that, frankly, the game is actually lower load than a lot.
Well, let me ask you, let's set aside health issues, even though, what about scarcity? What about there is a secret sauce to a league? There's a reason there's a national holiday in this country. It's 18 Sundays a year.
Yeah, so I agree with
right?
that. I don't think any number
and then
we would talk.
Tuesday night in early March in the league, you look at the schedule and it is just.
But I don't think there's a number that gets
burger.
us there, right? So we're at 82. Like let's say we went. I'll make up a number to 66, like our lockout season. There's not a big difference in scarcity between 82 and 66. There's a difference 82 and 16. What the NFL has, but we're not going to 16 games. So I don't think you get the scarcity benefits by cutting a few games, frankly.
Anybody think we should have more games?
Well, so this is what I was going to ask, which is
So we might not be at the optimal number if there's zero people who think it should go up, right?
Well, but
Why not expand to 100? Things are great, right?
But this is my problem with the argument of like if you cut games, you lose revenue.
Yeah.
You're losing revenue relative to 100 right now, right? So that's
there's such a thing as momentum of status quo, right? So our
Right.
arena businesses have been built up over time, over around 41 home games. That's how they operate. So there's not even room to expand games in a lot of our buildings. We just couldn't play them. So yes, even if there's no one who feels we should expand games, that doesn't logically mean we therefore have to reduce, right? You could be at a number that the industry has grown around and makes sense. I'm not saying we shouldn't cut games. There's benefits to it for sure. But you do have to take into account the financial pieces, and it's a hit.
I don't think there's a lot of momentum internally at teams in the league to cut games. I've heard that from a lot of people outside the league, but I have not heard that.
Again,
I don't feel
only in the
strongly about this
context of
issue.
these other goals,
Right.
right? If there are teams who think we should have play-in tournaments or a mid-season tournament or do these other things that to do those, maybe you'd have to cut some games, and I think we're open to that. But no one's pounding our door down to say just take out games.
Just because this was so much fun, Kirk Goldsberry asked, what about letting home teams draw their own three-point line?
Where's Kirk?
You'll have fun with the shot charts for that. You got to adjust it for every game.
Yeah, it would just completely screw up data, right?
it'd be like baseball with like various parks, and you have a pitcher park.
So every team with a big man would make it the
I mean,
restricted area?
baseball's funny that way. We just kind of take it as an article of faith that like a ball hit a certain way is going to have 30 different outcomes.
Yeah.
And yet,
Soccer too. I mean, there's different sized pitches all over the world, right?
If for a conference full of data people, you're probably not very excited about more variability in the underlying rules, but maybe, yeah.
this is, and I think you, a question from a fossil, and the fossil is now being identified, is David Aldridge. What do your teams do to make sure that your shops and leagues are open and available to talent not from traditional analytical businesses, schools, et cetera?
Wait, say that again.
What do your teams do to make sure that your shops and leagues are open and available to talent not from traditional analytical businesses, schools, et cetera?
Like a talent recruiting perspective?
Yeah, like what are we talking about? Jobs or what type of jobs?
Yes.
Or?
Jobs.
Jobs on the basketball side? Yeah, I mean, we have, I mean, there's still I would say there's more people working in basketball operations in the league who don't have an analytical background than that do by a large number still.
Yeah, most of the people working in this industry don't have the kind of background you're asking about. But in our data group, for example, 2 of the people we hired, one of them was getting a political science PhD at Duke, and he just posted some cool basketball stuff online, and we hired him. And another guy was at the University of British Columbia getting a human-computer interface PhD, and he also posted some interesting things online, and we hired him. So the quick answer to your question, I think, is if you're not from a traditional top school at something, but you can do really good work, just make sure that people see it, and you'll probably get hired.
But to that point, I think that, so I recently wrote an article about like my path and other people's paths to get a job in the NBA, because it's a question that I get a lot. And one of the things is that, I mean, there's good economic reasons for this, but one of the things that involves essentially sacrificing a lot of money and time for very little pay to get your foot in the door. And that's a pathway that you have to go, but that is biased towards a certain socioeconomic set. And so, you know, to that point, there are probably things that teams could be able to do to help increase diversity, you know, from that standpoint.
There's a guy at the conference who presented last year, John Carter, who's got a program that's doing really good work introducing kids who wouldn't normally get access to higher level math and science education through sports in some inner city schools. He's here somewhere. You should talk to him about that program too.
Right there?
He's over there. That's pretty cool, the stuff that he's doing, and it's introducing a community of people who wouldn't ordinarily get involved in the sort of things that this conference talks about to that kind of work.
I mean, we could have fellowships for teams.
Yeah. Well, and just kind of really quickly on that topic, there's the math, right? Which, you know, it does obviously help to be able to do the math, but then there's also figuring out what the right questions are to solve. And the person who does the math doesn't have to be the one who figures out the questions. And figuring out the questions oftentimes requires real expertise in basketball that sometimes the guys who do the math don't have. And so I think that for people who really like this and their core expertise or their background is heavy in basketball but light in math and sciences, this doesn't mean that you're kind of forever excluded from understanding analytics or really impacting it, you know, in a real way. I think you know, there's definitely a market for people who figure out what the interesting areas are, and I don't think that's a pure math question.
Returning to the playoff reform, what about the possibility of a mini tournament to decide the 8th seed in each conference, or these sort of play-ins that we're hearing about this week?
Yeah, so Zach Lowe wrote about one concept yesterday. I think what gets lost in that is, you know, we talked about the success of our lower seeds in the playoffs is not very high. So I've always looked at the concept of a play-in as actually not about the playoffs themselves, it's about the regular season, right? And so Mike showed his chart of the number of teams in contention at each point in the season in a 1-16 versus conference model. The beauty of a play-in tournament is you can actually create more lines or tiers throughout your standings. So right now we draw one line in each conference, top 8, bottom 7. And so there's that one playoff race, if you will. And once you're locked into either one of those buckets, there's not a whole lot of incentive to compete other than to maybe move up a spot and get a better matchup, but it's not big. So for example, the model that Zach wrote about where, you know, essentially the 7 and 8 seed would have 2 chances to lock in a playoff spot, the 9 and 10 would have 1. It creates 3 lines instead of 1. So a team would want to be top 6 to lock in a spot. If they don't get there, they'd want to be 7 or 8 to have those 2 chances. If they don't get there, they want to be 9, 10. And so in years where maybe you wouldn't have had a playoff race in a straight 1-8 model, now you'd get multiple races, if you will, towards the end of the year. So we look at it more as a way to both boost regular season competition and excitement, but also create a nice little lead into the playoffs with single elimination content, which is across sports one of the most valuable things you can have. And we have it sporadically through Game 7s, but to do it in a consistent way is just interesting. It's not something we, you know, are sort of rushing to do, but it's on the.
If you do something like that, you have to deal with the draft somehow too,
Yeah,
right?
for
Because
sure.
the 10 seed is, now you're getting towards the higher draft picks. And so what happens with that team? Does it make more sense to be 10 and win a few games and stay in the playoffs and still get good draft lottery odds? Or what do you do there? There's interesting issues that would need solving before you put that into place.
This is a really interesting question. Can you, and I'll put it to Evan since you're from the league, can you talk about how the league can measure if a change is actually being effective?
Yeah, so and that's through our fan research, right? So we do a ton of surveying, as I said.
Is the customer always right, though?
No, no. But I think we can. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? So we have basketball experts at the league, we have analytics people, we have our marketing people, we have content people. So everyone coming together to look at these issues. So for example, for our game flow work, we formed an internal committee last season that had about 20 league office folks representing all those different groups. And we just got in a room for 4 hours every week, just poring over all the data we had from our basketball side. How are players performing? How are our injuries evolving? How are fans consuming the game? And trying to make the best decisions we have given all that data. And then when you change things, you can then go monitor and say, we have some great A/B testing now, right? We changed this. What was the outcome? To ratings, to survey data, to basketball, like player performance, all those things. So it's actually pretty easy to measure some of these things.
How do you do that with the changes that have been implemented in the G League? Like, I love the experimentation in the G League, but I also wonder, is it different enough game from the NBA? And, like, how do you even evaluate that?
It's hard, but, I mean, we try. So, like, we have a lot of, we use the G League as an R&D lab of sorts, and we have a lot of rules at any given time we're testing there. And we have a weekly report that comes through about how those rules are playing out. But, yeah, it's not perfectly apples to apples because the game's different. So, for example, when we were looking at intentional foul changes or hack-a-shack, right? We changed rules in the G League, but it wasn't a prevalent strategy in the G League. So we couldn't really test, would this last 2 minutes of every quarter rule we proposed, how would that impact G League play? Well, it wouldn't have because there wasn't use of the strategy. So we have to kind of pick and choose our battles.
Right. What happened to Rafael's pick your playoff opponent thing that was happening in the G League or D League that it was? No? People didn't like it? I don't know.
What do you guys think?
Pick your opponent. One thumbs up from someone who works with Rafael.
No, but I mean, it's not.
One thumbs down from
the
someone who
idea.
doesn't.
Wait, to be clear, the idea is not pick your opponent. The idea is to solve for your critique of reseeding 1 through 16.
Right.
So every single issue you identified as a problem, I just solved.
It's funny, there's a question about expansion. We just have not heard about it a lot other than outside of Seattle, Washington. Is it something, first of all, the cost-benefit analysis of that. I mean, how do you guys look at that question? It's has huge implications in terms of revenue.
Yeah, that's more on the business side than where I focus. Obviously, the levers there are how much more money would that team bring in relative to the share of media dollars they'd get. From our perspective, we'd have to look at talent distributions. Do we have enough talent to fuel a 31st or 32nd team? But not something that I'm often involved in.
Y'all have any thoughts about expansion?
I mean, the basketball people talk a lot about talent dilution, and I don't. I mean, the talent is clearly more diluted than it was when there were 8 teams in the early '60s. But it's just hard to say that is there a big gap between the last player on most NBA rosters and the best 30 guys in the G League? It's not clear that there is. So, but then it's the gap between those guys and the next 30 guys, right? So
It seems like that given international play and given the G League and everything else, I mean, it seems like the dilution question is, I'm not as worried as I used to be about dilution.
well, there's also the dilution at the top, right?
it's not
It's not
dilution
just
at
the
the- it's not
dilution at the bottom. It's
So
the
it's-
dilution at the top. There's only so many stars.
Right.
And it doesn't look like the number of those has gone way up, although you might know this better than I would.
It's
so.
actually marginally up, but nothing significant.
All right, this is a good way to end.
The people in Seattle should have a team. I
Yes,
think.
they should.
I'm from Seattle. I want a road trip home, so I'm in favor.
But I don't know that needs to happen through expansion.
I'm a member of the media. I would like to go to Seattle.
There we go.
This is actually a good way to close. How do you accommodate the league's most tenured fans who care deeply about the league's tradition, but at the same time striving for innovation?
This is like one of the hardest problems for me.
Good, you have 90 seconds.
My dad, I sit with my dad every game at the same seats he's had since before I was born. We moved arenas at one point, but it's basically the same seats, way up top. And I mean, he thinks there should just be organ music, nothing else.
Send him to Atlanta.
And I have a spot in my heart for that. It's really, really difficult. So, then for a while I was also the team's business side lawyer, and I was like approving stuff that was going on during the game and just thinking, what is my dad gonna think? It's a disaster. Just so difficult, so difficult. The Mavericks did the game without a bunch of other stuff going on during the game.
Yeah, the Knicks as well.
Right, the Knicks did that too. And I sort of like it, we get used, when you're working for a team, you get used to watching games with no audio and no timeouts. Because that's how we scout. And we'll be talking, but there's no audio, it's just a video playing on a screen. And so that's still appealing to me, but I don't think the average fan likes it that much. And it's where the revenue drivers are, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, my perspective is it's all about incrementalism, right? Like, if we only catered to our core traditional fan, we couldn't grow, right? We would just never generate new fans. But at the same time, if we make wild, radical changes and alienate that core fan, we're not doing our jobs either. So I think it's about incremental changes as the market evolves, and you try to maintain that fan base while still growing and attracting new, younger fans.
Yeah, I still spend a significant amount of time on that side of the business, and I get that there are people who are traditionalists who like things to be the way they always were. But if you look at them as a whole, for people who are tenured fans, it turns out that even that whole end up, hugely liking the changes that are ultimately implemented, right? They don't like everything, but if you look at fans who've been with us 20 plus years, any of the changes made, 90% of that group still approves of the changes. Yeah. So yeah, there's the curmudgeon who wants things to be the way they were 50 years ago, but you don't cater to that person.
There's also the Red Auerbach story, right, where he had once said there will be Celtics cheerleaders over my dead body, because he was used to being the opening act for dance things back in the 50s. And so he had said that, and our owners, Wick and Steve and Rich, our president, were thinking about having a dance team. We were the last team to not have one. And they went to him and they said, we're thinking about having a Celtics dance team. And he said, no, we can't do that. The Celtics will never have one. And they said, well, we think we have a sponsor and a bunch of sales opportunities. We'll make like $500,000 off it. He said, you should have one tomorrow.
Good. A perfect way to close. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks.